Hi, it's Scott Vogel on sex addiction. Today I'm going to talk to you about understanding addiction to fantasy sex. Now, fantasy sex addiction takes on a lot of different forms, mainly role playing, pornography viewing, online chatting in this role play fantasy mode. Now, fantasy in the bedroom is not always a bad thing. In fact, it can be a very healthy way for people in a long-term relationship to keep that sexual, physical relationship fresh and healthy. However, fantasy sex for some can develop into an addiction that will become, over time, a very devastating obsession. You see, sex addicts who are addicted to fantasy sex become obsessed with the fantasy at the expense of all other aspects of their lives. The intimate physical part goes away and the fantasy becomes the obsession. And like other sex addicts and sex addictions, those addicted to fantasy sex are unable to stop without some kind of professional help or intervention, treatment, or 12-step program of recovery. The biggest challenge with fantasy sex is it can be difficult to identify because everybody has different fantasies. And the fantasy addict may have other forms of sex addiction, such as pornography, masturbation, prostitution. So, what is the difference between healthy and unhealthy fantasy usually goes towards the obsession and the inability to stop, and going from an intimate, physical, healthy relationship to a focus always on the fantasy. So, the key to identifying a sex addiction involving fantasy is the obsession. Sex addicts with a fantasy addiction become obsessed again with the fantasy, and their focus is the fantasy, not the sex, as we talked about. So, if you use the relationship to pursue the fantasy, chances are that it's about the fantasy and not the relationship. When you think of the different types of fantasy, the first thing that usually comes to mind for most is role playing. In fact, role playing is a very common form of fantasy for sex addicts with a fantasy addiction. For sex addicts, a lot of times this may start out as a suggestion to a partner to role play. And as the addiction progresses, the roles or scenarios become much more extreme and may even become dangerous to one or the other. A sex addict with a fantasy addiction may pressure their partner or even force them to play roles they're uncomfortable with as the fantasy addiction starts to spiral out of control. Now, as time goes on, the addict will come to rely on the fantasy for their sexual release. And at this point, it becomes very obvious there's a problem. The addiction at this point is no longer easy to hide. Pornography is another way that sex addicts will use to create a fantasy sex addiction because they can live out their fantasies in any way they want. The experience of viewing pornography can be enough for some to engage with their fantasies. The use of pornography and fantasy addiction combined can become a dangerous mixture for a sex addict because viewing the pornography often leads to masturbation, which becomes excessive and part of the overall addiction cycle. And over time, viewing pornography is not enough. They have to take it to the next level. It progresses, and they start to regress to having to find more ways to fulfill their need for the fantasy. Now, the progression over time is they might move on to cybersex, where they have a need to engage in sex through chat rooms. It could be through phone sex hotlines. It could be through cam sex with camera to camera. It could be through sexting, a lot of different ways. And it could end up leading to prostitution to play out the fantasy where they'll hire a prostitute to fulfill their actual fantasies. For other fantasy addiction, the actual addiction might not center around role-playing or pornography viewing. If, for example, the fantasy may be focused on a certain sexual act, it may be focused on a certain location, or it may be focused on a certain circumstance. For example, some people have a fantasy for having sex in public. It might involve the thrill and the risk of getting caught, or it may be focused on the thrill of the idea that others may be watching. It can be pretty much anything. It might be a fantasy of having sex in a movie theater or sex in a park, so that's locations, or a certain circumstance where they meet somebody at a certain place and they create this whole detailed scenario around what the actual fantasy is, and over time they could potentially start acting it out. Now, there are a lot of consequences that come with fantasy sex addiction. Like others, it's not just plain old vanilla harmless, because the obsession starts to lead to the neglect of important work, their duties at work, their responsibilities to family, to social, to groups, to colleagues, to friends. This can then lead to a myriad of other problems. Financially, it could start to take toll when you're spending a lot of money on prostitution or online sex or different sex acts that are pulled in by the fantasy, thinking, well, it's just fantasy, it's okay. Well, the financial problems mount, the relationship problems, the social problems. The sex addict in fantasy starts to live a life of fantasy, moving away from the life of reality. Now, a sex addiction involving fantasy can really devastate a person's life. When we talk about relationship problems, they can suffer quite a bit. The addictive behaviors that they engage in start to become unacceptable to partners, spouses, friends, family, colleagues, and so the relationships start to fall apart. The obsession can cause the addict to become withdrawn, which usually happens, and this can lead into a problem with intimacy and trust issues in any relationship when the person does become withdrawn. And finally, somebody that's looking to enter into a relationship usually enters into an unhealthy relationship because they want to fulfill their needs. So they'll go find somebody that might participate in the fantasy with them, and that's not a healthy relationship. In a healthy relationship, healthy mutual fantasy in sex is healthy, but finding a partner just to act out sexual fantasies in itself is unhealthy. So we talked about fantasy sex can be healthy if it's agreed upon healthy and it's for the purpose of healthy sex. It becomes unhealthy when it becomes the obsession. It's difficult to identify because it's hidden, and it could be just a healthy fantasy sex. The different types of role-playing and pornography and cybersex and cam sex. The pornography becomes a major issue because it becomes so addictive, it's so available and accessible and affordable. And then other fantasy addictions, when we start to look at the addiction to sex acts, to locations, and to circumstances. And the consequences of fantasy sex, like any other sex addiction, can become very severe over time as the person withdraws and the relationships and their whole life focuses on the fantasy sex and not their responsibilities. Please visit our YouTube channel on sex addiction for more videos on sex addiction and recovery from sex addiction. Also visit our blog on sexaddiction.com, where you'll find a free video explaining what sex addiction is, the 7 symptoms of sex addiction, the 4 traumas that cause sex addiction, and the 4 faulty core beliefs that are caused by those 4 traumas. You'll also find the solution in recovery from sex addiction, the 7 paths of success, as well as additional information, articles, audios on sex addiction and sex addiction recovery. This is Scott Vogel on sex addiction